All right, Colton, you're not alone. Sitting here all by yourself quietly.
Yeah, thank you. It's kind of a funny feeling.
Yeah. I'm just trying to get comfortable after being so comfortable a minute ago.
No, I know.
Oh.
Midday Shavasana with a shamanic journey.
Oh my goodness. All right, Colton, you're not alone. See? By yourself quietly.
Yeah, thank you. It's kind of a funny feeling.
Yeah.
So Gail Colton just moved to New Hampshire.
I'm just trying to get comfortable. So comfortable.
Somebody's playing back the Facebook thing,
Yeah,
so we can
that was
hear.
me.
Yeah. It's kind of funny. I'm like, wait, that just happened. How's that?
Deja vu.
I know. Wow.
It was so funny. The other day we had an astrologer on here and it kept replaying what she was saying and we couldn't figure out what it was. And then afterwards I realized it was me because I'm watching it on Facebook for comments and questions and everything.
Right.
So yeah, it was totally me.
So Colton, you just moved to New Hampshire?
Yeah, about 6-8 months ago, somewhere around there.
Where are you in New Hampshire and from where?
In Peterborough, and moved from Northern Virginia.
Northern Virginia. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, welcome.
Thank you.
I've been here now 2 years.
It's so far, it's an awesome place to be, even in the middle of a pandemic.
Uh-huh.
Awesome. We've got some people joining us on Zoom. That's so great to have.
Cool.
Everybody here, we'll get started in about 2 minutes. Welcome everybody who's joining us on Zoom. So good to have you. And everybody watching on Facebook, thank you so much for being here in community with us today. So Colton, I'm just going to read from the bio that you had provided in the form that I had sent you, unless there's anything else you want to add. Okay, perfect.
Now, I'll add a little bit at the beginning to
you'll
put this in context, but.
Don't you just love it? A whole life and you get 3 sentences.
Yeah.
He gets 2
and a whole lot more.
All right, awesome. Well, we'll go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Shae Sterrett, and welcome to Start Strong 2021, day 4, heading into our second workshop of the day. And I'm so excited to introduce you to Colton Seale. Colton is retired from the FBI after 22 years as a special agent, finishing his career as team leader and head of training for an elite interagency interview and interrogation team. Supervisory Special Agent Seale began his career in the Anchorage Division and later spent 6 years overseas investigating counterterrorism matters and conducting high-value interrogations before coming to the HIG for his final 7 years in the Bureau. He's recently retired and he now runs Pyxis Academy, applying the science of interviewing and interpersonal communication with an array of corporate and individual clients to improve culture and performance and assist teams and individuals who engage in challenging conversations and situations. So happy to welcome him here. I think we can definitely all benefit from a rich conversation about communication. We know how much it can impact us in our interpersonal relationships, but also maybe even with ourselves. I do want to remind everybody that this workshop is being recorded. So if you don't want to show up on YouTube or a website or Facebook, please go ahead and turn your audio and your video off. And at this time, I'd like to hand the reins over to Mr. Seale so he can get his workshop started. So thank you so much for being here today. If you have questions along the way, you can ask them in the chat, you can ask them on Facebook, and I will be monitoring that. So Colton, I'm gonna make you a co-host and then I'm gonna go ahead and spotlight you and you can get started.
All right, cool. Well, Thank you very much. And yeah, please, if questions do come in throughout this, just let me know, no problem. And thanks, Shae, very much for having me here. I'll say I'm suffering a little bit today from like imposter syndrome or something, because I'm not a shaman nor am I a healer or any of the other cool things that people seem to be who are talking during this. I'm just here to talk about talking to other people. But it is a topic that I'm just passionate about and very excited to have the opportunity to talk to you guys about it. Just a little more background on who I am. Like Shae said, spent 22 years in the FBI and interviewing, started off interviewing, like bank robbers, drug dealers, that kind of stuff, and then murderers, homicide subjects, and moved into terrorists and spies. And absolutely the best part about the job was talking to other people. The problem was when I started off in the Anchorage Division, as Shae said, and we only had 19 agents there. So we were the smallest division by far, covering the largest territory. So a lot of days I was interviewing, 8, 10 people a day, and I loved it, but we hadn't been taught very well at all how to do that, unfortunately. There was no science behind it. It was just whoever came before you, what they told you worked, right? And about 10 years later in my career, ultimately I ended up becoming affiliated with the High Value Detainee Interrogation Group. Terrible name, sorry about that. I spent 10 years trying to get the name changed, but failed at that along the way. But the reason the HIG existed was because nobody in the US government had actually studied how do you talk to other people? How do you get information from other people who don't necessarily want to give you that information? And then we also led those high value interviews. They use the term interrogation. I also hate that term and tried to move it. But sorry, there's somebody in the interviewing room, I assume or the waiting room.
Yeah, no worries, I'm taking care of that.
Deal with that.
You keep going.
So anyway, the point of the HIG was to conduct that research and then to do the interviews. And my job was to take the research and put it into a form that we could train other people. And it worked very well in the world of terrorists and spies. But what I found more importantly was it works in real life and it's helpful in real life and a regular life, I guess, just not terrorist spy life. And life is better, right, when other people want to talk to you, other people want to cooperate with you and work with you and support you. Right? And that's what I hope to get across today is how to take some of this stuff and just put it into real life and to make life better when you're more effectively communicating with other people. But first, I want to talk a little bit about maybe why we're not as good communicators as we tend to think we are, because I think that's important to just kind of keep in mind as we move forward. So first is all of us have had good conversations with people and not as good conversations with people. But those ones that weren't as good, we tend to rationalize those in some way. Well, it didn't go as well as I would have liked because of this, this, or this, or it was them, right? It wasn't me. And we don't take that as an opportunity to actually learn, what could I have done differently? We rationalize it, we remember the good ones, and we think, yep, I'm a good communicator, and we forget the bad ones, right? So going through life, it's every day you have a conversation with somebody and something in that doesn't go as well as you'd like. So take that as an opportunity to say, what could I have done differently within this? The second bit is, right, I'm talking to you all right now, and you're hearing what I'm saying and you're seeing me and seeing the fact that I keep looking at my computer and not the camera, and I apologize for that. But what you're not getting is what's going on inside of me. I'm thinking about different things. I'm thinking about the research underlying what I'm talking about. I'm thinking what I'm trying to communicate to you and why, and I'm experiencing certain emotions. You're not privy to that, right? You're not privy to my internal states. You only get what you see. But as humans, we tend to believe that the other person we're talking to picks up on what's happening inside of us, right? And that we're communicating all of that. But in reality, they only get what's on the surface, right? So we have to keep that in mind as well, that when we're talking to someone, we need to figure out how do we expand that conversation to communicate the stuff that I think they're getting, but that they're not getting because they're not privy to those internal states. And third thing to keep in mind is if you're talking to someone else about something, right? It might be about a physical object. It might be about an idea, a plan, whatever that is. in some way, you're assuming that they're perceiving that other thing in the same way that you are. But think about it this way. Every moment in your life, you bring your entire past with you, right? All of your past experiences, life history, all of that comes with you. And it creates lenses that filter how you perceive a certain situation, right? And nobody else in the world has the same lenses that you do. Nobody else has the same life history that you have. They might be similar, but there are still differences, right? So everybody perceives any situation differently from everyone else, but we tend to forget that, right? We forget that my beliefs and values and kind of worldviews that form the bedrock of who I am based on my life history are different than everybody else's. So when we're engaging with someone else, first remembering they're not perceiving it the same way that I am. And then being curious about why am I perceiving it this way, right? That's metacognition, thinking about thinking. Why am I perceiving it this way? And then being curious about how are they perceiving it that is different, and making that part of the conversation, not just the thing we're talking about, but how are we perceiving this and why, right? So those things I think are incredibly important to keep in mind, just that nobody perceives the world the same way that you do, and nobody else is privy to your internal states, right? And I would love to talk about those in a lot more depth, and I think they deserve it, but I have some other more specific things that I want to get to that I hopefully will be useful, that you guys can implement kind of immediately to improve communication, be more effective communicating with other people. So, sorry, I'm gonna try to figure out how to share my screen here, but I guess before I do that, every time that we interact with someone, basic psychology comes into play, right? And we interact with people at 3 different levels, right? First is that affective level. So it's kind of that, the feelings and emotion level, that raw level, right? And then we interact with them at a behavioral level, which is the external manifestation of kind of that internal state that manifests itself in how I behave. And then third, and finally, we interact with them at the more cognitive level, right? The prefrontal cortex level. And we need to keep all of those things in mind as we're dealing with other people. So, see if I can pull this up. Sorry about it.
Perfect.
Perfect, except I always struggle with making it go ahead. There we go. All right. So it says rapport up there, and that's essentially what we're getting at with all of this, is how do you develop rapport with another human being, right? Which rapport is interpreted and in a lot of different ways. The way I look at it, ultimately, it's just being in sync with someone else, understanding where they're coming from, where you're coming from. Those 2 things can be different, but if you both recognize where it's coming from, that starts to get you in sync. With behavior, you'll see that there's a lot of specific things we do to sync behaviorally with someone. And then finally, that cognition bit, that how am I thinking about this thing and why am I thinking about it this way, in a sense? What am I trying to communicate when I'm talking? So the cool thing is that at each of these levels, we have specific things that we can do to help smooth that interaction with other people and to make that communication more effective. So with affect and behavior, I'm going to draw a lot on research by a friend of mine, or 2 friends of mine, actually, Professors Lawrence and Emily Allison, who are at the University of Liverpool. And I want to plug a book that they just released. It's called Rapport, and it's a brilliant book and definitely worth reading if you're interested in this stuff. It forms kind of just a portion of my methodology, but I will say it's kind of the heart of it. Their work has been groundbreaking and outstanding. And then the third part comes from a guy named Professor Paul Taylor, another good friend of mine, who runs the Center for Research on Security Threats. There we go, which sounds like a strange name, but it's out of University of Lancaster in the UK. And if you go to their website, they have research on just fascinating topics, how ideologies are developed and transmitted. And stuff that I think is really relevant to the world that we live in today. So if you're interested in that stuff at all, it's just crestresearch.ac.uk. So the website has fascinating stuff on it and worth looking at. So those are my plugs for my friends. But their work has really informed a lot of what we're talking about here. So these things are easy to remember. Affect, behavior, cognition, just ABCs of psychology. And those things come into play whenever we interact with someone else. So we're going to talk about affect first and how we manage that. And more importantly, how do we get somebody to the point where they have a positive affective feeling toward this interaction, right? They feel like this is a safe place to be. This person is a safe person to talk to, and I want to talk to them. It changes the internal state that they feel good about this interaction and they feel okay. We're going to talk about 5 things that came out of the research that lead to that feeling. A thing to note is that if we do these things well, we get that good affective response. If we do them poorly, what we do is we create reactance. That feeling, this is not safe. I don't want to be talking to this person, and I'm going to push back, right? It may be at a level just below the surface that you're not really seeing it, right? That internal state that we're not privy to, but it's going to be there if we don't do these things well. If we do them well, it allows somebody to make that decision themselves. I want to engage with this person. I want to talk to them, right? So it draws on a thing called motivational interviewing. And if anybody's familiar with motivational interviewing, this isn't pure motivational interviewing. It's adapted a little bit differently based on the research that we've done in terms of just getting other people to want to talk to you. But what the Allisons found were there are 5 key parts to this. Autonomy, acceptance, adaptation, empathy, evocation. In the book that I mentioned, they've changed it a little bit to come up with a nice acronym that makes it easy to remember. I unfortunately don't remember the acronym because I'm not a big fan of acronyms, but these ones are pretty easy to remember as well. It's 3 A's and 2 E's. So, and to be honest, whenever I'm getting ready to go talk to someone, if I have my note cards, I just write 3A, 2E at the top to remind myself to be a good interviewer. I've been doing this for decades, and I still need that little reminder every once in a while. But so autonomy is just that feeling that you have agency within the situation, right? You have a choice within the situation. And we create this by offering people choices, right? Just small ones. There's obviously always a big choice of, you can talk to me or not talk to me. You can be here or not be here, right? And it's okay to recognize that sometimes. But building in small little choices is important. If somebody comes into your house or you meet them somewhere, offering them the choice of where they want to sit, right? And you think about it, that seems kind of silly and pointless. But say there are 2 chairs, and I tell you, go ahead and sit in this chair, right? You probably were ambivalent about which chair you sat in. You didn't care. But the second I tell you, sit in this chair, what are you thinking inside? Oh, I want to sit in that chair. I don't want to sit in this chair. I want to sit in that chair, right? So taking away that autonomy, even at micro levels, creates little bits of reactance. So anything we can do to build in autonomy, and very often that's just being quiet and listening to somebody else, giving them the autonomy to speak and to talk about what they want to talk about. We can always move it where we want to go later, but it's just letting them have that choice, right? So super important. The next one is acceptance, right? And it's kind of funny, Shae mentioned, or I can't remember Shae, or I think maybe it was Gail who mentioned it, but doesn't it feel weird when your entire life is boiled down into 2 sentences? Right? Mm-hmm. And the point of that is that all of us have all different facets to who we are. And the second someone defines us as one thing and doesn't accept us as a person who has all these other parts to them, again, reactance, we kind of react. I'll say in my introduction, yeah, I was an FBI agent for 22 years, blah, blah, blah. But the second someone defines me as just an FBI agent, I hate that, right? I'm like, no, I'm not. I'm much more than that, right? I have 6 dogs. I have a lot of books. I love literature. I love all this kind of stuff, right? I'm more than that. So anyone we're engaging it with, it's trying to figure out what are they trying to communicate, or what have they communicated about their identity, and recognizing those different facets of their identity. Even if just a little bit, just say something that shows that you get that they're also this, this, and this. And the other part, which is harder, I think, is remaining non-judgmental, right? That's the other huge part. The second somebody feels judged in any way, right? Reactants, they're going to push back. Nobody likes to be judged, right? So, Shae, is that a question? Sorry, see a hand up.
No, I was just acknowledging you. One of the things that we've been talking about this week is Carl Rogers' unconditional positive regard.
Yeah,
and
exactly that.
Yeah,
Yep. So perfect. I teach a lot on Microsoft Teams, and they have a little hand thing that goes up when somebody has a question. So I thought that's what that was. But cool. So it's exactly that. It's unconditional positive regard for all their parts, and being non-judgmental, just accepting who they are, right? Doesn't mean you have to validate it, right? Or I'm talking to, as an FBI agent, when I was talking to murderers, terrorists, right? I didn't say, yep, way to go, good that you're a terrorist, right? Didn't validate it, but I accepted that that's who they were, right? And that's important. You might not be talking to terrorists, but you're going to be talking to people that have parts of them that you don't like or you don't agree with. Right? I have good friends who have very different political beliefs than I do, but they're still my friends, and I recognize that those are their beliefs, and that's cool, right? That they're theirs. I don't agree with them, but fine enough that they have them, right? Next, adaptation, which is any conversation that you're in, you may have an agenda, right? You might have a reason you're talking to this person, or a place that you want to get, or something you want to find out, whatever it is, you might have that. But conversations don't work that way. Conversations go in all different directions. And it's being adaptive and being willing to go where the other person wants to go. And if I were teaching like interviewing, right, I'd tell you kind of how you can move that conversation back where you want to be. And there's a way to do that, which is just active listening, to be honest, just picking up on what they're saying and how can I respond to that, or ask another question in a way that moves it kind of where I want to go. So it's fine, but really just being adaptive and going where that conversation goes. And from my perspective, the reason this is so important is because everybody we talk to has kind of fascinating life histories, fascinating things that we can learn from them. And if we stay on that main highway that we want to be on, we're not going to learn all those things. If we go off on the blue highways, right, those back roads, that's where we learn this stuff. That's where we find cool things. And that's adaptation. That's where that takes us. It's just going where they go, following their lead. And if we have someplace we want to be, we'll find our way back there, right? So just not worrying about that. Just checking time. Empathy, that I'm sure you guys in different of these presentations will talk about empathy some. It's a really hard skill, right? I've been training this stuff for a long time. Empathy is the one thing that people struggle the most to learn. I think one of the reasons is that we confuse, as a society, we confuse empathy with sympathy. And sympathy has its place, and that's fine, but it's not empathy. They're two different things, right? Empathy is that attempt to see the world from someone else's point of view and to show them that you're trying to see it from their point of view, right? And that can be difficult because, like I said, no two people see the world the same. We will never see the world the way somebody else does. And which leads to, as we're trying to do that, staying away from the words, I understand, right? You hear people say that, oh, I completely understand. I completely get that. The reality is, no, you don't, right? You may have an idea, but you do not completely understand. And when people hear you say that, they tend to think, well, that's nice, but you don't, right? So the opposite is, the way to go about it is, how do I just paraphrase back what they're saying essentially? to show that I'm trying to understand and see it from their point of view, right? And the example that I use a lot, my wife died 7 years ago. I now have a new wife who's awesome and great, and she's listening right now. But when people would say, oh, I'm really sorry when I said my wife died, right? That's sympathy. And I was like, okay, great, thank you. I get the intent, I get what they're trying to do, but I'm sorry is about you, right? It's not about her who died, right? So the right way to approach it is, that must be really difficult. Tell me about her, or tell me about how you're dealing with this, or anything like that. That's more empathy, right? And then finally is evocation, which is just that attempt to understand what is below the surface of whoever you're talking to. What do they believe? What do they value? What do they care about? And it's active listening. It's picking up on what they're talking about, but exploring that further. Wow, what led you to that? That's really cool. It's just those things. How did that make you feel? Tell me more about that. Whatever it is, to pull out those beliefs and values. That's what motivates people, is when somebody else is making that attempt to understand who they actually are, right? And making that attempt to pull out those beliefs and values and that other bit to understand truly who this person is that I'm talking to, right? So I'm gonna pause for a moment there, for a moment here, I guess. Just any questions or comments on any of that so far?
Well, Colton, the comment that I have, just because, when you started your presentation, you had said there's this little bit of imposter syndrome because you're not a shaman, but so much of what you're bringing up really resonates with what we've been talking about so far this week, is that, there's something happening on the surface, but there's like a million things happening below the surface. And these kind of tools, whether it's with a spouse or a child or a peer or an employee, are so effective to get below the surface.
And that's the goal of this, is to allow somebody with the autonomy and the acceptance, that feeling that this is okay, and I can let that stuff to come to the surface, and then showing that interest, right? And it's the way I phrase that is, when you're engaging with someone else, it's be interested, not interesting, if that makes sense, right? And be interested in pulling out what is below their surface, right? So, all right, any other thoughts on that? All right.
Are you going, sorry, it took me a minute to unmute. Are you going to be giving us some examples of some of the, like, be interested versus be interesting?
Hadn't thought of that, but yeah, I mean, it's good. It really is. If somebody is telling you a story, our natural inclination is to tell a story back, right? Mm-hmm. So, oh, cool, that happened to you. Let me tell you what happened to me, right? We always call it the "my dog is blacker than your dog" syndrome. Right? Oh, you have a black dog? Well, you should see my black dog. My black dog is really black, right? And what it is if you're going to say something, to say, oh, I have a black dog too. Tell me more about yours, right? Great. So that communicates a little who you are, but it puts it back to them, to give them the space to tell more about theirs, and not trying to tell your story, which I know I struggle with, even studying this and knowing this, right? You go and you start hanging out with somebody and you want to tell your stories. It's just give them a hint of your story and go back to theirs, right? And that's the natural flow of conversation, is turn taking, right? I talk, you talk, I talk, you talk. And when you think about that, your talking, if you really want to understand who somebody is, should be just a little bit, and then turn it back over to them with an open-ended question. Well, tell me more about your dog, right? And then let them go. So hopefully that makes sense. I have a couple other bits we want to talk about. So that's the affect part. If we deal with the affect, right, these things make it people feel safe to talk to us and talk more and tell us more, and it makes that interpersonal communication smoother, better, right? Then we have to deal with the behavior, which gets a little more complicated. I will do my best to try to explain it here, but behavior happens. Well, the most important thing to remember is behavior doesn't happen in a vacuum. Behavior happens in relation to somebody else's behavior, right? So our behavior plays into that interaction. The good thing is we can do things to modify our behavior to allow somebody else to feel comfortable with theirs. And if they're behaving in a way that is kind of maladaptive, that is not productive, we can use our behavior to move them to an adaptive, productive place. So we'll get to that. First is just there are two dimensions on which behavior occurs. One is about power, right? It's does the person you're talking to want to be in charge, want to be in control, or do they want you to be leading the way, right? So high power, I want to be in charge. Low power, I want you to be in charge. The second one is, my little pictures are in the way of this, but is competition. So it's, I want to compete, right? I want to be direct, firm, competitive in this interaction, which isn't always bad, but it's that end of the competition spectrum is more competitive. The other end is the friendly. I want to be friends, right? I want this to be just a really nice interaction, right? There's a continuum there. And we put these things together because they work together. So I'm going to move forward here. And this is a wheel that Dr. Allison developed. The history of the interpersonal behavior wheels goes back through an interesting list of characters. Timothy Leary, if anybody remembers him from the 60s, he actually was a brilliant psychologist before he decided experimenting on himself with LSD, which didn't work out quite like he expected, I don't think. But he developed one of the first iteration of the interpersonal wheels iteration. And before that was, can't remember his first name, but Marston, the guy who created Wonder Woman. So the wheels have a colorful history anyway, but they help us understand how to interact with other people on the behavioral level. So just basically here, I'm gonna turn on my laser pointer. If I'm engaging with someone who wants to be in charge, they're high power, right? What I need to do initially, and we'll get to that, I can move later, but initially, I need to move my power down, let them be in charge, right? It's what happens when we're both trying to be in charge, right? We're fighting for that control, essentially, right? So somebody's got to change. So generally that someone is going to be me when I'm dealing with someone else, right? So they want to be in charge, I lower my power, right? So that's the power axis. The other one, the competition, the west-east axis, works a little bit differently. If they want kind of competition, they want to be direct, frank and forthright, that kind of stuff, I meet them there, right? So this one, we go up, down, they go up, I go down, they go down, I go up, right? If they want me to be in charge, I'm in charge. Here, if they want to be direct, they want more competition, I give them that. I meet them there, right? And if they want to be friendly, kind, social, warm, I meet them there, right? So, but those two axes work together, right? It's usually not just one or the other. So if they are kind of competitive and wanting to be in charge, so they're just being very confident and assertive, right? And here's what I believe, here's why I believe it. I'm going to tell you about that. I'm confident in this, and I'm going to tell you all about my beliefs. I need to move my power down a little bit, but on the competitive side, right? Which the label we've come up with is patient and pensive. I'm thinking about it. I'm listening, I'm being patient, but I'm thinking about it and I'm asking questions about it, right? So I am not completely low power, just open and listening. I'm questioning, but I'm doing it in a patient, thoughtful way, right? Or they're in charge, but they're trying to be supportive, helpful, but they're still in charge. I just moved down to respectful and trusting. Right? I respect your expertise. I respect and appreciate that you're trying to help me, and I'm going to go with that. Right? So they go up, we go down. They go down, we go up. They go left, we go left. They go right, we go right. Right? So that's if everybody's being kind of friendly and good. But the way that this is really helpful is dealing with difficult people. Right? When somebody's behavior is maladaptive. Right? So we call kind of the adaptive wheel the good wheel, the maladaptive wheel the bad wheel. Right? First thing we need to remember is our behavior should always be here, should never be on the bad wheel. Right? But other people's behavior might end up on the bad wheel. So instead of being confident and assertive, right, and here's what I know, here's what I'm going to tell you, let me tell you about it, they want to be argumentative and competitive. You're wrong, here's why you're wrong. I'm right, here's why I'm right. Okay, great. Any guess where our behavior goes at this point? Same place, right? They're up in power, they're competitive, we lower our power, but stay competitive, we just move to patient and pensive. We listen, we question, but we don't engage with them in an argumentative, competitive way, right? That ultimately will draw them over to the good wheel. It'll move their behavior to an adaptive behavior to confident and assertive. Right? And examples on that, having interviewed a lot of people who this is where they start off. And a guy I was interviewing a while ago who was an ISIS guy, and all he wanted to do was argue with me and compete with me about how he knew more than I knew and blah, 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 blah. And within probably 10 minutes of my just being patient, questioning a little bit, engaging with him on it and thinking about it, he was over here on the good wheel and ended up talking to this guy for 7 days. And took probably 15 minutes really to move him off of that bad wheel. He'd pop back over here occasionally. I'd adjust my behavior, pull him back over. And then ultimately what happens is I'm here, he's here. I can now start raising my power a little bit, right? If I need to drive this conversation forward, if I want to drive it forward, if I have an agenda that we need to get to, I can start moving up. The natural psychology is once I've got them over here, and let them be there for a while. If I move up, they'll start to move down a little bit, right? They'll meet me here. Then I can pop up a little bit more, and then we can go back and forth. And that's fine, because if I'm talking to someone, I want them talking probably more than I want me talking, right? So I can lower my power again and turn it back over to them to let them take control and talk. Right? And it works the same way I've been using the left side of the wheel, but if we're on the right side, the friendly side works as well on that side, right? If they're, I can't see it over here, but it's parental and patronizing. If they're being patronizing and, oh, you're an FBI agent. Yeah, I bet you're a really good FBI agent, blah, 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 right? I just respectful, trusting, listen. Yes, it's great, thanks. Then I can move up and be more friendly and gradually pull them over to here. And then I can move my power up where I need to. So it works the same on both sides of the wheel. But all you really need to do is keep in mind 2 dimensions. Power, if they want it, let them have it for a while. If they don't want it, if they're like, oh, what do you want to talk about? I'm not really sure why we're here. Here's why we're here, and here's what we need to talk about, right? Your power goes up, you lead the way. They want competition, go ahead and give them a little in a good way. Or if they want to be friends, give them that, right? So kind of a quick run through what generally takes about a day to teach at least, but questions or thoughts on that so far?
The thought that's coming up for me is that you really have to be like confident in yourself to be able to get to a place of, I feel like I've gone into so many conversations that were really like ego charged. But so you really have to be confident in yourself, your core value, there's like such a level of confidence that you need to have to be able to move up and down, move that dial up and down. It's just so interesting. I hadn't thought of it.
That is a big part of it. And I think that's why people fail a lot, because they are concerned that if I drop my power, right, I'm just giving this thing over to them and I'm never going to be able to get it back, right? So you end up trying to push your agenda, staying high power, and that's what happens, right? You fight and you never really get it forward. The opposite is if they're low power and you go low power, you just get inertia. Nope, nothing goes anywhere, right? It becomes an incredibly boring conversation that nobody wants to be part of, right? So being aware of that and having that confidence that I can drop my power, that's fine, because I know how the wheels work and I know that ultimately I can raise it again. And then we get to that point where we're kind of flip-flopping, and that's where you want to be, is where you're going up and down, right? And I think it's that confidence. It's also knowing yourself, right?
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. For me, it's if I'm not confident enough in myself, if I don't know myself, I'm going to flip up here because my ego gets in the way. It really is checking your ego at the door when you walk in.
Yep, it is. And that's like just checking the ego and whoever it is I'm engaging with, just again, that being interested. And it's not about my ego. It's just about what I can learn from this interaction and how I can become better through it. And, you know, from the FBI perspective, it was every single person I talk to knows something that I don't know. And I want to find out what that is, right? So to get that, I've got to leave my ego at the door. And you also have to know yourself in the way of what am I good at and what am I not good at, right? So, you know, I'm pretty comfortable being up here, right? So that's my natural tendency, is to be kind of in charge or confident and assertive or frank and forthright. Right? I can struggle if I have to be on the friendly lower side of the wheel. That's not my comfort zone. Right? I've learned it because I'm recognizing that I'm not as good at this, but I have to be good at it when I need to be there. So it's just practicing. What am I good at? Great. What am I not good at? And focusing on that and getting better at it and more comfortable in those places. And also recognizing that if my comfort zone is confident and assertive, so I didn't mention, these wheels are on a continuum. Confident and assertive is the good, kind of good way of being in this, sorry, forgetting the word I'm looking for, expression. So that's the good expression. Argumentative and competitive is the bad expression of the same behavior, essentially, right? It's a continuum from here to here. So if I'm really good at this, this is my danger zone. I can easily slide along this continuum and end up over here, right? Or if I'm really good at just listening, I can slide along a continuum to being weak and submissive, right? Which is the bad expression of that. So it's recognizing the danger zones and that you have to move, right? You have to be good at all of these, because if I'm patient pensive and somebody's confident and assertive, that works for a while, but it doesn't work for an hour or two. It starts to fall apart after a while, basically, right? Inertia starts to sit in when you're constantly in the same place. So you need to be able to move around the wheel and change behavior after a while. So, which is another learned skill that takes practice, but it also comes back to knowing yourself and that confidence that I can go ahead. I think the confidence goes both ways. The belief that you can lower your power and it will be okay. Also the belief, though, that I can raise my power at some point and it'll be okay. Right? I'm not going to start a fight. If I've been doing this right and I raise my power a little bit, it's not going to start a fight. But internally, we start to think, oh, if I try to push this a little bit, it's going to start a fight. If I'm doing this right, it shouldn't. Right? So, questions or thoughts on that? Cool. See how we're doing. A little bit of time. All right. So the third bit is kind of the cognition piece. And we'll look at it through a model that was developed by Paul Taylor. It's called the cylinder model. But what it does, it helps us to align our conversation with the way that somebody else is talking and more importantly, what is motivating them to talk in that way, right? So first, if we look at any conversation we're having with someone, they're going to come at it in one of three ways. Cooperative, which is great, I'm happy to talk about this. Competitive, I'll talk about this, but I'm going to push back, or I'm going to argue, or I'm going to compete in some way on this topic. Our third is avoidant. I don't want to talk about this thing that we're talking about, and I'm going to get away from it as soon as I can. And sometimes we need to talk to people about things, right? And when it comes to that point, it's very often things that they don't want to talk about, right? So what we need to do is figure out, how do we move them from avoidant to cooperative, essentially, right? So that's the first part. It's just their overall orientation to the thing that we're talking about. I'm good with it. I'm kind of good with it, but I'm going to compete, or I want nothing to do with this, basically. So that's the first part. Second part is, what is their motivation relative to the subject that we're talking about, right? Is it about them, right? Their identity, their beliefs and values, who they are, right? What are they trying to express in this conversation? So it can be identity, it can be instrumental, which means basically they're looking at whatever we're talking about as a problem to be solved, right? It's the engineer brain kind of taking over. Here's a problem, here's how we're going to solve it, right? Here's some facts and figures that go with this, right? And finally, relational, which is just about the two people talking. And sometimes people's motivation is just to create a relationship or tear apart that relationship with the person they're talking to. And I don't know if you can hear my dog in the background. She likes to help me teach sometimes. Sorry. But so we need to listen to the person, and what are they trying to express? Is it their identity? Is it instrumental? Is it a problem to be solved? Or are they dealing with the relationship between the two of us? I hate to make things political, but if you think about it, so we had Hillary Clinton as a presidential candidate, and at the same time, at one point, we had Barack Obama as a presidential candidate. Hillary Clinton was very instrumental. She communicated, here is a problem to be solved, here are facts and figures. Obama was much more identity-based. He talked about identity. The idea of hope is more related to identity than just solving a problem, if that helps to kind of put it in context. Kind of along the same group of people, I've met Bill Clinton a couple times. He was the most relational human being I've ever come across in my life. Right? His entire goal when he was one-on-one with someone was to create a relationship with that person. The second time I met him was like 6 months after the first time. He actually remembered who I was, which, if you think about the number of people he met in between, that seems an impossibility. But he's like, oh, I met you at this thing several months ago. You were the guy he'd ask me why my parents named me what they named me. He's like, your parents named me that because, and I'm like, how on earth possible? But that was his motivation in life, was that relational bit, right? So hopefully that helps kind of make sense of those things. So when we're talking to someone, we can use this as a guide. The way we look at it is, first, where are they? Cooperative, competitive, avoidant. And then what is that underlying motivation? So if somebody's happy talking about it, and within that, they're telling you who they are and what they believe, we say they're cooperative identity, right? If they're happy talking about it and solving the problem with you, cooperative instrumental. If they're happy talking about it and they're just talking about the relationship between us and how we can make that better and how awesome it is that we're all together and blah, 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 cooperative relational. So that's easy when somebody's cooperative. When they're avoidant and don't want to be talking about it, and it's something that we need to talk about, say, a boss dealing with an employee or something who doesn't want to talk about this thing, that's where it becomes tricky, right? They're down here somewhere, and we want them up here so that we can talk to them. That's where we really need to get in sync with them. Where are they? right? If I've asked, why is this thing that you're working on, not a cooperative instrumental question, why is this thing not working out the way that we'd hope that it would? Help me understand that. And they go off, tell me about how challenging their life is, and they have all these other issues in their life, blah, blah, blah. They're not answering my question, right? It's not telling me why isn't this thing working. It's telling me about them and going off on other tangents. So they're basically being avoidant, right? I need to sync up with them. Talk about what they're talking about. That's not the question I asked. Tell me, answer my question, right? Go with them, right? That adaptation, go with them, sync up with them where they are, listen to their language, start using the language they're using to reflect back that you're hearing that, right? And to get in sync with them on that topic. Then we can start pulling them up. So if they're being avoidant identity, they're telling me about themselves, about the issues they're having in their life, but it's not related to what I want to talk about. I go there, I talk to it, then I start moving up, right, to competitive identity. Right? Okay, you've told me all this kind of stuff. Help me understand how that is impacting what's going on at work, right? A little bit competitive, but it's still within their identity frame. Then I need a plan to move it up to cooperative, which is, okay, you've told me about this. Now let's talk about how this relates directly to this thing that I asked about earlier. Right? So then I've moved them up. It takes a while. You have to have a plan for it, kind of recognizing when you go in, if they're going to be avoidant, what am I going to do to move up? It helps to have a plan anyway. Very often you're in the midst of a conversation and you just got to deal with it. But having this model in mind, okay, they're avoidant. How are they, what's motivating them? Get in sync with that, and then I can start to pull them up. But if they're avoidant and you're cooperative, you're talking past one another. You're not ever going to get in sync and get where you need to be. And if I'm instrumental, tell me about this problem and how to solve it. And their identity, I'm going to tell you about myself, right? We're still talking past one another. So even if they're cooperative and I'm instrumental in their identity, I need to move over to identity, recognize that, get my language in sync with that, and then gradually start introducing the instrumental questions and moving it in that direction.
Colton,
So this,
I have a question.
yeah, great.
So if somebody's avoidant, for example, would you reflect back to them like, it seems like maybe you're avoiding this, or do you use that kind of reflective language, or is it something that's a little more nuanced and subtle as you're trying to bring them back up into that green zone?
I'm going to try to be more subtle about it at first and just, okay, they don't want to talk about it. I'll accept that. I'll move where they want to go. But then if I'm still struggling to get them to come up, I've tried, and maybe I've asked the question again, then I'm going to probably go there and say, I've asked you this a couple times and we've started talking about other things. So can you help me understand what it is about this topic you're not comfortable with? Or however you'd phrase it, right? So ultimately, it's fine to do that. But first, I want to try something else to kind of avoid creating, I guess, that reactance, which can come from that. But if I've asked 2 or 3 times, then it's perfectly fair to go there, and you kind of have to at some point. So, cool. So basically that is what I have, and I'd hope to leave a few minutes at the end, which I usually fail at. So, but for questions or thoughts or comments, or basically I'm open to talking about anything anybody would want to talk about.
I have another question. I love this workshop so much. When you're going into a conversation, do you, and I'm sure it varies from the people that you're working with, but do you go in and say, this is our intention for this conversation, like setting the groundwork, or like what's the first question you would ask? Is there like a common first question that you kick off a conversation with?
So 2 kind of different questions there. So I'll answer both. The first is kind of setting, why are we talking? And that is important, actually. I use the term engage and explain, but it's just basically setting, why are we talking, right? And that is really important, I think, because put it in the kind of example I used, if you're talking to an employee and you don't set that expectation of here's what we're talking about, what question is going on in their mind? Why am I here? What is he? Yeah, why am I here? What is it? What's going to happen? What does he want to talk about? Right. And from a psychology perspective, that creates cognitive load. Right. It increases the person's cognitive load. Right. Our working memory has, 7 plus or minus 2 bits of information that it can hold. Our working memory is not very efficient. Right. And when somebody's working memory gets filled up with those concerns and questions, what do they want to talk about? Why am I here? What's going on? Right. It makes it really difficult for them to engage in the conversation because their cognitive load is kind of maxed out. So that first part of why are we here? What are we going to talk about? And why are we talking about this thing is incredibly important. So even if I'm sitting down talking to, a terrorist or whoever, I'm going to lay something out there. Here's why I'm talking to you, right? And here's why I'm talking to you. And here's kind of what I want to talk about. Set that, but then you ask the first question. So having that in mind, what would you like to talk about? Where would you like to start this conversation, right? The autonomy, just turning it back over to them, right? And letting them have that first shot at it. Right? Because there might be things that I don't know about that they think are more important, that they want to communicate, that they want to talk about. Giving them the chance to put that out there. Like I've said, I can always move it back to where I need to be at some point, but letting them have the first shot at it.
That's awesome.
So I was coaching a guy the other day who is a interviewer for a company, and he was interviewing a kind of problem employee, I guess, but he brought in a whiteboard and just said, why don't you write up on this board the topics that you think are important and that we should cover? I was like, that is a brilliant idea. And it worked really well. Mm-hmm. And it came out of the conversations that we'd have, but he got creative, which is brilliant, and did that. And I was like, that's awesome. I love that.
Yeah, I wonder if you have other examples like that, maybe some examples from other clients you've worked with and who you like to work with. And I'd love to hear a little bit more about that too.
So I guess who I like to work with is, I still am involved with the intelligence community. I'm still doing a lot of work with them, and I love that part. But to me, I think this stuff is equally impactful outside of the intelligence community. So working with companies to improve not only their kind of investigative capabilities, but their communication, right? If every company is constantly going through change and there's all that, how do you communicate that change with people, and how do you understand people's concerns with it and recognize those concerns and deal with them? And I think all the stuff that I teach deals with that. So I've started doing some of that, and I really, really enjoy that. Been working one-on-one with people. And I think in terms of what I enjoy, it goes back to some of the stuff we've mentioned a little bit about the kind of bedrock of all of this is you've got to know yourself. And spending time with people to kind of dig through those layers to understand why they are the way they are and why they perceive the world the way they do. That is critical to interacting with other people and getting those kind of aha moments of, that's why I behave like this when somebody is annoying me, right? Or when I'm having a difficult conversation, right? It's because, I was dealing with a guy the other day who he kind of recognized this, but after talking about it for a while, he grew up in a difficult household. His brothers are both in jail now and tough life. I think he'd never quite realized how that impacted the way he interacts with other people. So just unpacking that. While it sounds kind of like I'm trying to be a psychologist, I'm not. It just relates to how do you interact with other people and why, and giving people that space to talk through that and kind of a model to do it rather than my just digging into their stuff. Here's a model. Let's look at this model. So it depersonalizes it a little bit and lets them put their stuff on it and then talk through it.
And I think it speaks to compassion, which is a topic that's come up quite a bit over the last couple of days, having compassion for somebody else. I mean, I imagine even maybe with the terrorists that you've talked to, you know, even having compassion for someone like that, and that maybe that helps you be a little less charged when you're going into that really difficult conversation. Then somebody on Facebook is saying, I can see where it could be really helpful in helping employees work through conflict, especially when they have different values or beliefs, which you had kind of started your conversation with. You have friends and they don't have the same beliefs as you, but you're still friends.
Still friends, right? And you can have different values, but it's hard to have that conversation if you're not making that part of the conversation in a sense, right? That just that recognition that we're seeing it in different ways. And I might not agree with your values, but curious about them and where they came from and why they're important to you, right? And not arguing with them about it.
Yeah. The other question I have, and you probably are running, I mean, we all know people are working online. They're not even working in offices together anymore. And I wonder how communication is evolving because we're not having face-to-face interactions. We're not seeing body language. I wonder what your thoughts are on that in this Zoom world that we're living and working in right now.
Yeah, I've actually started trying to look at that because I think it is really important. And even on Zoom, right, you're still only just kind of seeing my face and it's a little teeny picture. So it makes it difficult. And then we're also, you know, just more email and text and all of that. It's, again, looking at the language people are using and being able to incorporate their language into your responses and first making sense, why are they using this, but how do I reflect back to them that I'm hearing using their language rather than my language? Because when you're using yours and I'm using mine, again, we're talking past one another. And we can moderate that better when we're in a room together, but when we're just texting back and forth, it becomes really difficult. So it's spending that extra few minutes to really make sense of what are they communicating with the language and how do I kind of sync with that and send it back to them. And I guess as an aside, you know, within the FBI, one of the ways that I use this a lot was when you're recruiting informants. And a lot of time we'd have to recruit informants online for cyber type things. And we actually spend a lot of effort on doing exactly what I'm saying, is matching our language to theirs to get in sync with them. And then ultimately to be able to kind of say, hey, here's who I actually am. Would you like to work with me? But if you've kind of gotten in sync with them and built that rapport, usually the answer has been yes. So it does work, but it's hard.
Yeah. Well, it's so interesting. Like, you know, I have two sons and they're in their early 20s and they're communicating with like okays and emojis and, you know, like my father who sends me a text message that's a page long. And
right.
So that gap and still make communication effective. And somebody was mentioning on Facebook about social media. It's so tricky to communicate on social media, and yet it's one of our largest forms of communication. So
I'd say with the emoji thing, because I find myself kind of gravitating to being able to do that sometimes as well, but that's not effective communication in general. So just if you get an emoji, how do you just push it back to them with kind of an open-ended question that kind of needs a response, not an emoji?
Yeah. It's interesting. I think this topic is so important for that specific reason. You know, is that you can't have communication with emojis. You can, but you know, it definitely lacks the effectiveness. So, and I
close questions, get emojis, open questions. Ugh, I actually have to respond to this.
Yeah, which it brings up a good point in terms of how you frame questions when you're interacting with somebody. Yeah, which it could be a whole other webinar, a whole other workshop.
Yeah, it is. But two things on that is, open-ended questions. And when somebody starts talking, you're going to immediately have questions that you want to jump in and ask. just shut up and hold those questions. Right? They'll probably answer them if you let them keep talking. If you jump in and interrupt with a question, right, now they're never going to get back on that same trajectory they were on. You've moved it a little bit, so you've interrupted it with your question. So best is always just hold those questions.
Yeah, and I know I've heard this, I don't know, where people are just like waiting to talk versus actually listening. Being that active listener is definitely such a skill too. Wow.
Yeah. My next question is going to be awesome.
Yeah.
So.
And, one of the things that I've learned as a therapist, as a yoga therapist, is when I'm working with people, if I have a question, if it's important enough, it'll come back around if they're, when they're done. So, yeah. Well, that just flew by.
Yeah.
That was incredible. Thank you so much. Yeah, I just want to, recognize you and all the work that you've done over the last 2 decades and the way that you're bringing your work back to the world. I think it's so amazing and such a great time to bring this back into the forefront of people's awareness. Communication is so important, especially when there is divide, which I think is really reflected in our society right now. So thank you so much for being here. This was wonderful.
Well, thank you for having me, and I truly do hope it was interesting and useful to everybody.
Yeah.